The Victorian house did not feel empty, it felt abandoned. The air in the master bedroom was thick, carrying the sterile, metallic chill of a space that had not been inhabited in decades. I spent my first 3 nights sleeping on a mattress on the floor, too exhausted by the move to care about the heavy, oppressive wallpaper or the absolute, suffocating stillness of the rural property. But I could not ignore the wardrobe. It stood against the far wall, a towering, monolithic block of blackened oak. It was easily 8 feet tall, casting a long, rectangular shadow that permanently darkened the corner of the room. The wood was carved with intricate, sharp geometric patterns that caught the pale moonlight. The most unsettling detail was the hardware. The 2 massive oak doors were not secured by a delicate keyhole. They were bolted shut from the outside by a thick, industrial iron hasp and a heavy brass padlock. You do not put a heavy exterior padlock on a bedroom wardrobe to protect your clothes. You put it there to keep something trapped inside. On Wednesday morning, I noticed the floor. The original hardwood was layered with a thin, uniform coat of gray dust, but directly in front of the wardrobe's heavy clawed feet, the dust was disturbed. 2 deep, raw gouges were carved into the polished wood, curling up tiny, pale splinters. I knelt down, tracing the fresh cuts with my index finger. The splinters were sharp. I looked up at the towering oak box, then back down at the floor. I measured the distance from the base of the wardrobe to the edge of my mattress. It was exactly 10 feet. Thursday morning, the distance was 9 feet and 11 inches. The fresh gouges in the hardwood were longer. The wardrobe was moving. A cold, irrational paranoia took root at the base of my skull. It was a solid oak antique, weighing easily 800 pounds. A draft could not move it. A settling foundation would not drag it in a perfectly straight line toward my bed. Thursday night, the psychological pressure became a physical weight on my chest. I could not sleep. I lay rigid on the mattress, staring at the black monolith across the room. At 1:00 a.m., I reached for my phone. I propped it up against a glass of water on my nightstand, angling the camera lens directly at the base of the wardrobe. I pressed record, the small red timer ticking silently on the screen, and forced myself to close my eyes. Friday morning, the cold woke me. I sat up. The shadow of the wardrobe was cast across the foot of my blanket. It was noticeably closer. The distance was now 9 feet, 10 inches. I snatched the phone from the nightstand. My thumb hovered over the screen, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. I stopped the recording and opened the video file. I dragged the slider through hours of static, gray footage. The room remained perfectly still. At the timestamp 03:14:00, a visual anomaly occurred. I paused the video. I pinched the screen, zooming in tightly on the absolute bottom of the wardrobe, right where the 2 locked doors met the baseboard. The heavy brass padlock hanging from the hasp did not move, but at the very bottom of the doors, from the microscopic, vertical hairline crack between the 2 panels, something was protruding. I maximized the brightness on the screen. They were fingers. Dozens of pale, impossibly long, multi-jointed fingers were slipping out from the suffocating darkness inside the sealed oak box. They slid down the exterior wood, pressing their flat, translucent nails into the hardwood floor. I watched, paralyzed by the cold, undeniable proof on the screen, as the pale knuckles turned stark white under an immense physical strain. The fingers dug into the floorboards and slowly, methodically, dragged the 1,000-pound iron-locked cage 1 inch closer to where I slept. The daylight offered no comfort. It only illuminated the terrifying reality of the geometry, 9 feet and 10 inches. I did not run. Fleeing the house would require abandoning the logic of the physical world, admitting that my sanity had fractured. Instead, I clung to the rigid laws of physics. The wardrobe was an 800-pound box of antique oak. It required friction, leverage, and force to move. If I removed the leverage, I killed the movement. I spent the afternoon in the dusty basement of the Victorian house. I found a heavy steel toolbox left by the previous owner. Inside were 4 thick, industrial iron L-brackets and a handful of 3-inch galvanized lag screws. I carried the hardware up to the master bedroom. I knelt on the gray, dusty hardwood and positioned the thick iron brackets completely flush against the front of the wardrobe's heavy, carved claw feet. Using a socket wrench, I drove the lag screws directly down into the floorboards, burying them deep into the structural joists of the house. I wiped the cold sweat from my face, staring at my work. The iron barricade was flawless. It provided thousands of pounds of sheer resistance. The wardrobe could not slide forward. That night I did not set up the camera. I sat cross-legged on the center of my mattress, a heavy wool blanket pulled tight around my shoulders. I kept the bedroom lights off. The silver moonlight spilled through the tall window, casting the towering, rectangular shadow of the wardrobe across the floor, stopping inches from my knees. I watched the black monolith. I waited for the timestamp. At 3:14 a.m., the ambient temperature in the bedroom violently plummeted. The physical chill penetrated the wool blanket, sinking directly into my bones. Frost began to rapidly crystallize at the edges of the window panes, crawling inward in sharp, jagged webs. The crushing, absolute silence of the isolated property deepened. At the base of the massive oak doors, the heavy shadow shifted. The pale fingers emerged from the microscopic hairline crack where the doors met the floorboard, but there were not just dozens this time. The entire gap bristled with them. A shifting, undulating mass of long, translucent, multi-jointed digits spilled out from the dark interior, pressing their flat, white nails against the hardwood. They reached the iron L brackets. I held my breath, my chest tight to the point of agony, waiting for the entity to strain against the galvanized steel. The fingers did not push. Instead, the pale hands multiplied, flattening themselves entirely against the floorboards directly beneath the massive piece of furniture. The translucent muscles in the thin hands contracted, turning stark, blinding white under a sudden, immense physical strain. Slowly, without a single vibration, the entire 800-pound oak wardrobe levitated 1 inch into the air. It was not sliding. The entity inside was lifting its own cage. Supported entirely by a horrifying, writhing sea of pale hands, the massive black box glided smoothly forward, passing completely over the heavy iron brackets I had bolted into the floor. It did not stop at 1 inch. It drifted continuously, a monolithic shadow advancing across the moonlight. It set down onto the floorboards with perfect, terrifying gentleness. The distance to my mattress was now 4 feet. I was completely paralyzed, my eyes locked on the heavy brass padlock hanging from the iron hasp at eye level. The moonlight hit the brass perfectly. I noticed the alignment of the shackle. The thick, curved metal loop of the padlock was not clicked into the heavy brass body. It was completely open, resting loosely inside the iron hasp, entirely undisturbed by the violent levitation. The entity inside the massive oak box was never locked in. It was driving the wardrobe toward my bed, choosing to remain in the dark, waiting until the distance was perfectly optimized before it finally chose to swing the heavy doors open itself. The brass padlock hung entirely loose in the iron hasp. The realization severed my last remaining anchor to logic. The lock was an illusion, a deterrent placed on the exterior to ensure I never tried to open the doors myself before the distance was closed. The heavy oak doors began to move. They parted at the center line, swinging outward toward my mattress. There was no friction, no shudder of rusted hinges. The massive panels simply glided through the dead, freezing air of the bedroom, opening in absolute, perfect silence. They swung wide, extending forward until the thick, carved edges of the oak doors perfectly bracketed the left and right sides of my mattress. The wardrobe had expanded its geometry. It had formed a seamless, dark corridor leading directly off the foot of my bed. The silver moonlight spilled into the massive interior. It was not lined with cedar. There were no shelves or hanging rods. The interior walls of the wardrobe were sheathed entirely in thick, seamless plates of cold, rusted iron. Protruding directly from the iron walls, lining the interior like pale, shifting ribs, were the dozens of long, multi-jointed arms. The entity was not a single body hiding in the dark. It was the entire internal mechanism of the box. I sat frozen on the mattress, the wool blanket pulled up to my chin, my lungs completely paralyzed. The pale hands did not reach for my throat, they did not reach for my skin. Instead, the dozens of long white fingers extended downward. They reached past my legs and firmly grasped the thick fabric edges of my mattress. The translucent muscles beneath their skin contracted, turning stark white under the strain. They pulled. The heavy mattress slid smoothly over the gray dust of the hardwood floor. I was a completely rigid weight resting on a raft, being drawn effortlessly forward into the freezing, iron-lined dark of the oak box. I could not move my arms, I could not force my body to roll away. The psychological terror had induced a total chemical paralysis. I watched the ceiling of the bedroom slide away, replaced by the heavy, blackened oak ceiling of the wardrobe's interior. As my head crossed the threshold, sinking fully into the suffocating, freezing shadow of the box, the pale hands released the mattress. They retreated from the fabric, slithering up the iron walls to grab the heavy oak doors. They began to pull the doors shut. I stared up at the back of the swinging wooden panels as they closed around me. The moonlight caught the hardware. The thick iron hasp and the heavy brass padlock were no longer mounted on the exterior of the wardrobe. They were bolted to the inside. The lock was never meant to keep anything out. The antique was a portable, self-sealing cell, and the entity had spent the entire week methodically moving it into the perfect position to harvest me without a struggle. The pale fingers slipped the heavy brass shackle through the hasp. The two massive oak doors met perfectly in the center. The padlock snapped closed in absolute silence, severing the final sliver of moonlight and leaving me buried in the perfect, locked black.